Accidental Marriage by Shadina. Chapter 6. Roy blinked as he stared at himself in the mirror. His tux's collar was being fixed by his best friend, Mace Hughes. Hughes grinned at him through the mirror and patted him on the shoulder. "You look great," Hughes said with a grin. "Your bride is going to think so too. I can't believe you're finally getting married." Hughes wiped a tear from his eye. "After all this time, I thought you'd never find that perfect someone," he said. Roy just stared at Hughes through the mirror. Oddly enough, neither the fact that Hughes was there or that he was getting married seemed odd. Just the fact that he knew that this should feel odd, but wasn't feeling odd, was odd. But who was he getting married to? The name was on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't seem to get it out. He opened his mouth to ask Hughes, but Hughes beat him to the punch. Look at the time. You better get out there. The wedding's starting, and the groom is supposed to wait for the bride, not the other way around," Hughes said with a laugh as he pushed Roy out the door. Hughes followed him up the aisle. The priest was already there, but his back was facing them. He looked into the crowd and saw blue. It looked like the entire army was there, and of course, why would they wear something other than their uniform? Roy ideally wondered why he couldn't just wear his uniform. He stopped when he got to the altar. He looked around. He felt nervous, not because he didn't know what was going on. He did. He was getting married. No, it was because he was getting married that he felt nervous. But who was he getting married to? Shouldn't this concern him more? The priest turned around, a large book in his hands. Roy looked up to him, being that he was still on the floor in front of the altar while the priest was up on the altar. He blinked, dirty blonde hair, droopy eyes, and of course a cigarette dangling from his lip. Havoc, the only holy man he knew that smoked. Wait, since when was Havoc a holy man? That doesn't make any sense. Just as he was about to make it known that he didn't understand this, the bridal march began, and all thoughts of the smoking holy man left Roy's thoughts. He turned around to give his attention to his bride. Red! Red was the first thing that popped in his head. His bride was wearing a very red dress. Why red? Don't brides wear white? There was a red veil in front of her face, so we couldn't see her. He held out his hand when she finally got to him, and it was grasped by a white-gloved hand. Who was behind the veil, though? He started going through the list of females he knew. There were so many of them, though. So many he dated, did other things with. He was often referred to as the ultimate player in East and Central. He was so focused on trying to figure out who was behind the veil that he jumped when the book was closed. And so forth. Havoc finished. Roy blinked. Obviously, he missed everything the man said. "Let's just skip to the fun part, shall we, Jiv?" Havoc grinned largely. "You make us the bride." Roy looked at the veiled woman in front of him. Riza. It has to be Riza, he thought as she slowly started to lift up her veil, and Roy saw the blonde hair. His eyes widened considerably when he saw Edward. Edward Elric, the Full Metal Alchemist. He was getting married to a child. He felt himself lean forward as he mentally tried to get away. What was he doing? He can't kiss him. They're not supposed to get married. He's not supposed to get married. Roy felt the briefest contact of Ed's lips as he jutted awake. Roy panted, looking wide-eyed at everything. This wasn't a church. Nope, there was no smell of smoke, and he wasn't married. Oh, wait. Yes, he was. Damn it. Roy couldn't help but flop back down and groan into the pillow. He was married to the same blonde in his dream. It was difficult to believe, even for him. The very idea of him being married, much less to another male, was so foreign, Roy scarcely believed he'd ever come to terms with it. He was married. He ideally wondered how long it would take for him to suffocate himself in the pillow. The sound of the shower filtered through to his ears, causing him to pick up his head. Well, at least he was the groom. He shuddered at the thought of it being reversed. That would have just been too strange. He moved, so he was on his back again, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the water in the shower. That meant that obviously Ed was up. Maybe he's feeling better. Perhaps they should go look around. No, Ed probably needed one more day to fully recover. He'd just go on his own. It's like the boy didn't have enough books to keep him occupied, that little nerd. He didn't know how long he'd laid there and stared up at the ceiling, letting thoughts run through his head without any clear indication as to where they were leading to, just going along for the ride. He was pulled out when the sound of water hitting the ceramic tub ceased. The sound of the door handle turned made Roy look up to see his blonde wife come out wearing nothing but some blue boxers. His blonde hair dripping onto the plush red carpet, and the wet autumnal glistened. He frowned. The whole no shirt and boxer thing really blew his wife concept out the window, since it was obvious Ed was not a girl. He pushed himself into a sitting position, the blanket falling from his stomach to his lap. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Ed looked over at Roy, not at all embarrassed to be in front of him like that. "Fine," he said, simply staring at Roy. Thoughts filled both of their heads as they stared at each other. Married. Neither could wrap their minds around that. It just wasn't possible. Ed looked at Roy a bit. He'd obviously not deemed it necessary to remove yesterday's clothes before going to sleep. His blue button-up shirt had the top several buttons undone and favored one side over the other. It was crumpled, too. The red blanket covered the slacks he knew he was wearing. Honestly, Roy clashed horribly with his surroundings here. Maybe it was just the blue shirt. Ed's golden eyes seemed to zoom in meeting with Roy's unwavering gaze. It was odd, like he was remembering something while looking at him. Maybe he was. He continued to stare at the dark eyes, and his eyes narrowed a bit. Just what was it that he was looking at? It wasn't that interesting. Dark eyes reacted and narrowed as well, and soon the two of them were having a glaring contest for no reason. Just to do it. Eventually, Ed just couldn't take it anymore. The quiet, the glaring for no reason, the fact that his shirt was partially unbuttoned. "What's it, Colonel Bastard?" he growled to express his irritation. Roy shook his head and stood up, the blanket falling out of his lap. "Nothing," he said. "You sure you're feeling all right?" "Of course I am," he huffed. Roy pressed his lips together. "I see. Well, I want to play it safe. Go back and lay down. We'll go out tomorrow," he said as he stretched his arms over his head. Ed watched as the shirt slipped back into place on his shoulders, but also slipped forward, exposing more of his torso. Not that Ed cared. They were both guys, after all. "I told you I'm fine, though," the blonde growled. "I'm sure you are, but just to be sure, I want you to stay in bed," Roy said as he got up to go take a shower. He grabbed some clothes out of the drawers first. "I'll order breakfast when I'm done," he said before disappearing into the bathroom. Ed sat on the bed, pouting. He didn't want to stay here. It was boring here. Then he remembered he had some books. He quickly got up and went to find them. They weren't hard to find, not in the least. He grinned as he pulled a few out. These were books that he didn't even think Central had. Some he was sure had been banned. He took maybe one or two of those. Hopefully no one will search his belongings. He took a stack and brought it to the bed to start reading. He was so absorbed that he didn't notice anything else around him. Roy came out of the shower dressed how he deemed casual, a red button-up shirt, the first two buttons undone, and slacks again. His sleeves were pushed up to his elbows. He looked over at Ed, whose nose was stuck in a book. He doubted Ed would notice anything beyond it now. That's good, because Roy didn't feel like being stuck here. "I'm going out. I'll order you some breakfast before I leave," he said as he moved to grab a long black coat. It was windy out, making it a bit cooler than he would have liked, but still not as cold as Central. Ed didn't say anything or make any indication that he had been heard, so he just shrugged his shoulders and left. He did make sure to order him more of that hot cereal that he had loved so much. Roy stuffed his hands in his pants pocket as he headed off. He had no intention of being stuck in the hotel room with Edward. He did not want to pay for damages done to the hotel that would have occurred if he had stayed. It was different in his office. The military paid for it. A knock at the door interrupted Ed's reading. He looked up and told them to come in when the person announced it was room service. That's right. Roy said he was going to order him something to eat. He watched as a lengthy male rolled the card in. He looked a few years older than Ed, with short, thick, slightly messy brown hair and hazel eyes. "Good morning," he greeted cheerfully. "Morning," Ed returned the sentiment and watched him as he moved the silver-domed platter in front of him. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until his attention was pulled from his book by a cheerful boy. Golden eyes stared at the silver-domed platter as if stripping it with his eyes. He wondered what was in it. Waffles, maybe? Smothered with butter and syrup? Hot biscuits with thick gravy and sausage? Bacon? Eggs? What was in there? He swallowed the moistener in his mouth as he waited in anticipation. The cheerful waiter held a white cloth in his hand, and he grasped the handle on top of the dome and slowly started to lift it from the tray, as if put into slow motion. Ed started making quick guesses. He saw the bottom of what looked to be a white and blue bowl. What could be in it, though? Toast? There was a small plate of toast next to it, and on the other side was fruit, but the bowl, what was in it? Finally, the dome was fully removed. The light brunette smiled at him. "We heard you weren't feeling well. We hope that will change soon." He blinked when he saw Ed's shocked face. He looked down at the breakfast. Was there something wrong? He didn't see anything. The fruit was fresh, the toast wasn't burned, there wasn't a rat in the hot cereal, and the milk wasn't turned. So what could possibly be the problem? That bastard! Ed had a sour look on his face as he walked. That jerk ordered him hot cereal and milk. Ed had thrown a fit, knocking the stuff on the bed, on those expensive blankets. So now, here he was, walking along the beach, irritated, as room service was trying to figure out how to clean the mess. Hopefully the bastard wouldn't find out, but it would serve him right if he had to pay for it. Ed hugged his red jacket closer to his body when the wind picked up. The wind was cold, thus making the temperature cold as well. He grumbled a bit more. Wasn't the beach supposed to be nice, warm, and sunny? He continued walking, glaring at everything that passed into his line of sight, including those black things, whatever they are. As he got closer, he realized the black things were actually 3 men. They were making a lot of noise, but Ed couldn't figure out what they were saying or singing? Oh, well, it wasn't any of his business. Ed got pretty close to the 3 men and went to walk past them, only to find that they blocked his path. He looked up at them, blinking his golden eyes. The first man was tall and scrawny, like a twig. His short brown red hair was matted, perhaps from the wind. His shirt and working jeans hung off him loosely, making him seem even thinner. He had a stupid-looking face. The man in the middle was shorter and stout. His hair was non-existing on the top of his head. His eyebrows and goatee were a salt and pepper color to it. His eyes were squinted to the point they appeared to be closed, and he wore a large grin. He wore a white, slightly stained shirt under an open, worn brown jacket and working pants with boots. The last man was 4 or 5 inches taller than the one in the middle, but had a similar build. His brown hair was maybe half an inch long. His left eye was covered by an eye patch. His right eye was a gray color, though. He wore a thick-band knitted sweater with working pants and boots. "Why, hello, lad," the bald man greeted. "You look mighty cold. What be your name?" "Edward," Ed said almost suspiciously as he tried to walk past them. Instead, he walked into the man with the eye patch's outstretched arm. Ed was rolled in, so the arm was over his shoulders, and Ed was against his side. "Edward! A fine name indeed," the bald man continued to talk as the guy with the eye patch held onto him. "What was with these guys?" "My name is Brass. The tall guy's name is Larry, and the one that's got you is Doug," he introduced, that smile never leaving his face. Ed began to wonder if they were planning on mugging him or something. If so, they were in for a surprise. The tall man, Larry, was suddenly behind him, tugging on his braid. "Look at all this hair. If you're not careful, someone could mistake you for a loss." The trio got a good laugh out of this, which caused a frown to be formed on Ed's face and a slight ticking in his left eye. The wind picked up, blowing his jacket open on one side, but the big guy kept most of the wind away. The silver chain of his pocket watch was revealed. Larry quickly tugged on it, causing the watch to fall out. "What's this?" Ed growled threateningly. "I suggest you give that back," he warned, holding his gloved hand expectantly. Now, either they didn't hear him, or they just didn't care. Brass picked it up to inspect it, then moved over to slap Ed on the back, causing him to lurch forward. Very good, very good. That means you can celebrate with us." His grin only seemed to get larger, if that was even possible. "Celebrate?" he repeated, confused. Brass nodded his head. "Yes, celebrate." The 3 started to resume their walk again. Ed was confused. Just what were they celebrating? "There's a storm coming," Larry suddenly piped in. Ed stumbled a bit with them. A storm? They were celebrating a storm? Why? What was the point in that? He tried to ask, but it was so awkward walking so close to the Doug. It wasn't long before he was in a worn building. The inside was warm, but Doug's hand didn't remove itself from his shoulder. It was obviously a bar. Everything was made of a warm-colored wood. There was a bar with wooden stools that had small backs to them, a sitting area with booths, pool table, and darts. There was an old-looking boat with oars on either side of it, up near the ceiling on the wall behind the bartender's head. There were mounted fish hung up, and different old fishing and pictures, several trophies that decorated the building. Ed was brought over to the bar and plopped down on a stool. The 3 men crowded around him, as if to see how close they could get to him. Brass raised a hand. "Bourbon, my good lad." Suddenly, there were several glasses passed to them, but not for Ed. "Ah, you forgot one for the state alchemist." Larry's hand was back in his pocket, pulling not only the watch out as proof, but his wink from Ed. There was another glass passed. Ed didn't catch it, but Larry did. Here, drink to be healthy," he grinned largely. Ed took the glass from and stared at the contents. He had never drunk this stuff before. He had tried wine once or twice, but that was different. He got a little more of that. He looked at golden brown liquid and sniffed it. This didn't go unnoticed as Brass laughed.
It's not going to kill you. Drink up, boy.
Ed looked at him suspiciously before taking a sip. Brass laughed.
That's not how you drink it.
He tipped the glass up, forcing Ed to drink it all. It burned his throat and tears suddenly sprang in his eyes. He set the glass down and started coughing while the three started laughing and clinking their glass together as they started drinking their own. Roy had come back to an empty hotel. He had asked where the blonde boy went, but the receptionist didn't know. Said something about a mess in the room, and now he had left so they could get it cleaned. Roy didn't want to hear any more. He was happy being ignorant. By now, though, it was dark, and the brat still wasn't back. Roy tried not to worry, telling himself that Ed could take care of himself, as for a long time. He'd sent him off on dangerous missions he could handle with tourist plays. But even telling himself this, Roy couldn't help but worry about him. What if he was still really sick and his fever suddenly spiked on him? Nobody would think to tell him. He could have been kidnapped, had his automill taken from him to be sold, leaving him defenseless. Maybe he went to get something to eat and it was poison and... Roy's thoughts were cut off when the door opened and a figure lurched in. Roy sat up quickly and saw what was wrong with Ed. He moved over to him to catch him as he swayed. A giggle came forth from Ed, freaking Roy out a bit. He'd have to check his temperature. He picked him up bridal style, and that's when he got a whiff of Ed's breath. Alcohol. A flat look stretched across his face. Ed was drunk. Wonderful. Roy dropped him, none too gently, on the bed, but Ed didn't let go of his neck. Full metal, let go. He ordered him. You need to sleep. Sleep with me? Roy looked down at him oddly. Sleep with him? Was he crazy? No, just drunk. Ed, you're drunk. Let me go. He said to tug back, but Ed was surprisingly strong, especially with that automill arm, and Roy couldn't get loose. Sleep with me. Ed pulled him closer, causing Roy to bend down further. He felt Ed's clumsy lips miss his mouth and kissed the corner of it and his cheek. Roy's eyes widened. That's what Ed meant by sleep. Ed, let go, he said. Every time he tugged away, though, Ed's grip would tighten, and soon Roy was out of the bed. Damn it, he cursed. He felt the heavy automill arm holding him down, while Ed's flesh hand started to undo the buttons on his shirt and felt along his chest. This was embarrassing, Roy decided. Roy, Ed whined a bit. Please, Edward, no, he said. I don't want to be alone, he pleaded. You're drunk. You don't know what you want, Roy argued. I want you, Ed told him as his hand grabbed Roy's ass, pulling him up further. Roy grunted a bit. No, he told him again firmly. But no. He felt Ed's arms loosen. He pulled away, but they suddenly tightened again. Don't leave me, please, Ed begged him. Roy stared down at the golden, begging eyes inside. All right, but sleeping. No messing around. Understand? This seemed to make Ed happy, and he released his hold on him. Roy moved the blankets to climb in with him. He wondered what the hell he was thinking doing this, but he couldn't say no to those eyes. Ed moved to lie partially on top of him. He nuzzled his cheek against Roy's exposed chest, up the nook of his neck. He then started to kiss his neck, sucking on it as his hand ran across his chest. Roy grabbed that hand, stopping it. I said no, Edward. Stop or I'm leaving. No, Ed whined. He sighed and just dropped his head on Roy's shoulder, passing out. Roy glared up at the ceiling, the blonde sleeping against him. This was not right. What the hell did Ed drink that got him this wasted? Stupid boy. He looked down at the blonde and sighed a bit. Ed was going to throw a fit tomorrow if he wasn't too hung over to do so.